You know, for a long time I've wanted to make a video about Operation Aurora, the Google hack by China in 2009. It is one of those topics that have been requested a lot, but it hasn't come up yet on the channel. So here we are going over the full story. Hey, now this hack is really fascinating. It's like this spy story kind of thing, and there's a few reasons why this attack was so interesting. 1. The attacker was state-sponsored. This is not some random kiddo hacking into things. This is the Chinese government. 2. The victim was Google. Need I say more? Like one of the most recognizable brands out there? A trillion-dollar company? Basically synonymous with search engines? And they got hacked. They were infiltrated by another government. That's insane. No. 3. The motivation behind the attack was pretty unique. We're talking espionage here. The Chinese government wasn't looking to cause damage to Google or anything like that. They just wanted to get some information. They wanted to steal some data, and that's what they did. I want to be clear though. This isn't some random data breach or something like that, where the attackers just happened to stumble across some data that they were unsupposed to find. Like, no. This is targeted, malicious, evil, whatever you want to call it. Anyways, let's go over the timeline because this hack spanned multiple years. So between 2009 and 2010, Google noticed that some of its intellectual property was being stolen by the Chinese government. So that's when they pulled out of China. But then in January of 2010, Google releases this report saying that it has evidence that the People's Liberation Army was trying to hack into their systems to steal intellectual property. They gave a ton of details. They named the group that was doing this, the Comment Crew, and they released a bunch of malware samples that they had found. They even went to the US Congress and told them all about this. In response to this, the Chinese government said, "Shut up, you dirty American capitalist pigs." I mean, obviously they didn't say that. They did say that this was all propaganda and that the US should stop meddling in Chinese affairs. Anyways, fast forward to May of 2012, Google finally reveals the scope of the hack. They said that 20,000 of their intellectual property files were stolen, many of which contained source code. But the crazy part is that this only pertains to their Chinese operations. This was not a global hack against Google. Like, the attackers were specifically only targeting things related to China. And how do you know that? Well, because in 2013, an ex-employee of Google named Henry Ho went to court and he revealed some juicy details. He was actually the guy who was in charge of hiring in China. And he said that these infiltrators, the Chinese government, they were looking for specifically Chinese talent. They wanted people who knew both cybersecurity and the Chinese language. So they could be, communicating back and forth with their handlers and everything like that. So this was very targeted. This was not a global hack against Google. This was specifically a hack against Google's Chinese operations. Now, if you think about it, that actually makes sense, because the Chinese government doesn't really care about Google's US operations. They don't care about what Google is doing in Europe. They don't care about anything like that. They specifically care about what Google is doing in China, because if you run a search engine in China, you are a critical infrastructure piece. You are literally a gatekeeper. If you allow certain information to pass through your search engine, you are considered an enemy of the state. In fact, the Chinese government even requires companies that operate search engines in China to censor results based on keywords. And you can guess what some of those keywords are. Tiananmen Square, democracy, human rights, etc. So the Chinese government was definitely interested in keeping tabs on Google's Chinese operations. And if they thought that Google was getting a little too big for its britches, well, they had a way of putting that to a stop. The crazy part is that Google didn't even know that they were being attacked until 2009. This stuff was going on since 2006, but they didn't realize it until 3 years later. And I don't blame Google. It's not easy to detect this stuff, especially if you're focusing on the wrong things. For example, in 2008, Google actually released a paper called Breaking the Water Shoal, and it talked about how Google detected a sophisticated cyber-attack campaign targeting 27 major organizations. And guess who was not included in that list? Google. Yeah, they didn't even include themselves. They were focused on protecting everybody else but themselves. I guess they thought they were invincible. And how could you blame them? I mean, Google is a tech giant. Of course they think they're invincible. But the scary part is that this was intentional. These attacks were specifically targeted against Google. They weren't just collateral damage from some random cyber espionage campaign. Somebody at the Chinese government sat down and said, "We need to infiltrate Google's Chinese operations," and that's exactly what they did. Well, that's where things get interesting because the method used here was pretty ingenious. It's something that I haven't seen before, or at least not on this scale. You see, the main technique used here was social engineering. I mean, that's the first thing you should try anyways. If you're trying to hack into a company, don't try brute forcing the front door. Try going around back and sneaking in through a window. Now, this isn't exactly sneaking in through a window. Now, this is still a pretty sophisticated attack, but it's definitely not brute forcing the front door. What they did was create fake versions of websites that Google used internally, and then they sent emails, too. Google employees trying to get them to log into these fake websites. Now, these emails came from real IP addresses, and they even used names that were similar to the real domains. It's like different enough that you wouldn't notice it if you were in a hurry. So a lot of Google employees probably clicked on it and entered their credentials. And once the attackers had their username and password, they would simply try that on the real website, and if it worked, well, they just compromised another Google account. But wait, you might be thinking that's not possible. How do you even spoof an email address like that? Like, doesn't Google use SPF and DKIM and all that jazz? Well, yes, but you can actually get around that pretty easily. All you have to do is create a new email address, send a message from that address to yourself, and then forward that message to somebody else. And the DKIM and SPF stuff will apply to the original message, but not the forwarded message because that's not digitally signed. So you can kind of trick the system like that. Of course, this isn't foolproof by any means. Like if Google set up alerts for unusual login attempts, then they would have noticed it. But I doubt they did because otherwise they would have noticed the account takeovers happening. So maybe they just didn't even think about that. And yeah, that's the story of how China infiltrated Google. Like, that's it. The end. The Chinese government simply tricked Google employees into giving them their login credentials. And then they simply tried those credentials on the real websites and it worked. I mean, it's honestly kind of embarrassing for Google, especially considering the size of the company and all the resources they have available. But it shows us that you should never focus exclusively on technology. You need to incorporate people into your security strategy as well. The best way to do that is through training. Like, don't assume that your users are invincible. Don't assume that they'll always pick the right option. Assume that they will click the first link that they see in their inbox and work backwards from there. If you enjoyed this video, hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay informed, stay secure.